Welcome to Snoozecast, a podcast designed to help you fall asleep. Find us on snoozecast.com and follow us on Instagram @Snoozecast to find behind-the-scenes content. If you enjoy our show, please write a review on the Apple Podcasts app. Please know that we read and appreciate every single one. This episode is brought to you by Lost Powder Puffs. Tonight, for the start of our third annual Classic Horror Sleep Story series, which will air every Wednesday this October, we'll read the opening to The Phantom of the Opera, written by Gaston Leroux, published in 1909. Be sure to catch our other snoozy and a bit creepy sleep stories every Wednesday this October. This story is partly inspired by historical events at the Paris Opera during the 19th century and partly by an apocryphal tale concerning the use of a former ballet pupil's skeleton inspired by a German opera. Let's get cozy. Close your eyes. Relax your body into the softness of your bed. Now, take a few deep breaths. Chapter 1. Is it the ghost? It was the evening on which Monsieur Debienne and Monsieur Poligny, the managers of the opera, were giving a last gala performance to mark their retirement. Suddenly, the dressing room of La Sorelli, one of the principal dancers, was invaded by half a dozen young ladies of the ballet who had come up from the stage after dancing. They rushed in amid great confusion, some giving vent to forced and unnatural laughter, others to cries of terror. Sorelli, who wished to be alone for a moment to run through the speech she was to make to the resigning managers, looked around angrily at the mad and tumultuous crowd. It was little Gemma, the girl with the tip-tilted nose, the forget-me-not eyes, the rose-red cheeks, and the lily-white neck and shoulders, who gave the explanation in a trembling voice. "It's the ghost." And she locked the door. Sorelli's dressing room was fitted up with official commonplace elegance. A pier glass, a sofa, a dressing table, and a cupboard or two provided the necessary furniture. On the walls hung a few engravings, relics of the mother who had known the glories of the old opera, portraits of Gardel, Dupont, Bigottini. But the room seemed a palace to the brats of the corps de ballet, who were lodged in common dressing rooms where they spent their time singing, quarreling, smacking the cheeks of the costume dressers and hairdressers, and buying one another glasses of beer or even rum cocktails until the call boy's bell rang. Sorelli was very superstitious. She shuddered when she heard little Jeanne speak of the ghost, calling her a silly little fool. And then, as she was the first to believe in ghosts in general, and the opera ghost in particular, at once asked for details. "Have you seen him?" "As plainly as I see you now," said little Jeanne, whose legs were giving way beneath her, and she dropped with a moan into a chair. Thereupon little Géry, the girl with eyes black as plums, hair black as ink, a dark complexion, and poor little skin stretched over poor little bones, little Géry added, "If that's the ghost, he's very ugly." "Oh, yes," cried the girls of the ballet. And they all began to talk together. The ghost had appeared to them in the shape of a gentleman in dress clothes who had suddenly stood before them in the passage without their knowing where he came from. He seemed to have come straight through the wall. "Pooh," said one of them, who had more or less kept her head. "You see the ghost everywhere." And it was true. For several months, there had been nothing discussed at the opera but this ghost in dress clothes who stalked about the building from top to bottom like a shadow, who spoke to nobody, to whom nobody dared speak, and who vanished as soon as he was seen, no one knowing how or where. As became a real ghost, he made no noise in walking. People began by laughing and making fun of this specter dressed like a man of fashion or an undertaker, but the ghost legend soon swelled to enormous proportions among the corps de ballet. All the girls pretended to have met this supernatural being more or less often, and those who laughed the loudest were not the most at ease. When he did not show himself, he betrayed his presence or his passing by accident, comic or serious, for which the general superstition held him responsible. Had anyone met with a fall or suffered a practical joke at the hands of one of the other girls, or even lost a powder puff, it was at once the fault of the ghost, of the opera ghost. After all, who had seen him? You meet so many men in dress clothes at the opera who are not ghosts. But this dress suit had a peculiarity of its own. It covered a skeleton. At least, so the ballet girls said. And of course, it had a death's head. Was all this serious? The truth is that the idea of the skeleton came from the description of the ghost given by Joseph Buquet, the chief scene shifter who had really seen the ghost. He had run up against the ghost on the little staircase by the footlights, which leads to the cellars. He had seen him for a second, for the ghost had fled. And to anyone who cared to listen to him, he said, "He is extraordinarily thin, and his dress coat hangs on a skeleton frame. His eyes are so deep that you can hardly see the fixed pupils. You just see two big black holes, as in a dead man's skull. His skin, which is stretched across his bones like a drumhead, is not white, but a nasty yellow. His nose is so little worth talking about that you can't see it side face, and the absence of that nose is a horrible thing to look at. All the hair he has is 3 or 4 long, dark locks on his forehead and behind his ears." This chief scene shifter was a serious, sober, steady man. very slow at imagining things. His words were received with interest and amazement, and soon there were other people to say that they too had met a man in dress clothes with a death's head on his shoulders. Sensible men who had wind of the story began by saying that Joseph Buquet had been the victim of a joke played by one of his assistants. And then, one after the other, there came a series of incidents so curious and so inexplicable that the very shrewdest people began to feel uneasy. For instance, a fireman is a brave fellow. He fears nothing, least of all fire. Well, the fireman in question, who had gone to make a round of inspection in the cellars, and who, it seems, had ventured a little farther than usual, suddenly reappeared on the stage, pale, scared, trembling, with his eyes starting out of his head, and practically fainted in the arms of the proud mother of little Jem. And why? Because he had seen coming toward him, at the level of his head, but without a body attached to it, a head of fire. And, as I said, a fireman is not afraid of fire. The corps de ballet was flung into consternation. At first sight, this fiery head in no way corresponded with Joseph Buquet's description of the ghost. But the young ladies soon persuaded themselves that the ghost had several heads, which he changed about as he pleased. And, of course, they at once imagined that they were in the greatest danger. Once a fireman did not hesitate to faint. Leaders and front row and back row girls alike had plenty of excuses for the fright that made them quicken their pace when passing some dark corner or ill-lighted corridor. Sorelli herself, on the day after the adventure of the fireman, placed a horseshoe on the table in front of the stage door keeper's box, which everyone who entered the opera, otherwise than as a spectator, must touch before setting foot on the first tread of the staircase. This horseshoe was not invented by me, any more than any other part of this story, alas, and may still be seen on the table in the passage outside the stage door keeper's box when you enter the opera through the court known as the administrator's office. To return to the evening in question. "It's the ghost," little Jem had cried. An agonizing silence now reigned in the dressing room. Nothing was heard but the hard breathing of the girls. At last, Jem, flinging herself upon the farthest corner of the wall, with every mark of real terror on her face, whispered, "Listen." Everybody seemed to hear a rustling outside the door. There was no sound of footsteps. It was like light silk sliding over the panel. Then it stopped. Sorelli tried to show more pluck than the others. She went up to the door and, in a quavering voice, asked, "Who's there?" But nobody answered. Then, feeling all eyes upon her, watching her every movement, she made an effort to show courage and said very loudly, "Is there anyone behind the door?" "Oh, yes, yes, of course there is," cried that little dried plum of a Géry, heroically holding Sorelli back by her gauze skirt. "Whatever you do, don't open the door. Oh, Lord, don't open the door." But Sorelli, armed with a dagger that never left her, turned the key and drew back the door, while the ballet girls retreated to the inner dressing room, and Géry sighed, "Mother, mother." Sorelli looked into the passage bravely. It was empty. A gas flame in its glass prison cast a red and suspicious light into the surrounding darkness without succeeding in dispelling it. And the dancer slammed the door again with a deep sigh. "No," she said, "there's no one there." "Still, we saw him," Jeanne declared, returning with timid little steps to her place beside Sorelli. "He must be somewhere prowling about. I shan't go back to dress. We had better all go down to the foyer together at once for the speech, and we will all come up together again." And the child reverently touched the little coral finger ring which she wore as a charm against bad luck, while Sorelli, stealthily, with the tip of her pink right thumbnail, made a St. Andrew's cross on the wooden ring which adorned the fourth finger of her left hand. She said to the little ballet girls, "Come, children, pull yourself together. I dare say no one has ever seen the ghost." Yes, we saw him. We saw him just now," cried the girls. "He had his death's head and his dress coat, just as when he appeared to Joseph Buquet." "And Gabrielle saw him too," said Jeanne. "Only yesterday afternoon, in broad daylight." "Gabrielle, the chorus master?" "Why, yes. Didn't you know?" "And he was wearing his dress clothes in broad daylight?" "Who? Gabrielle?" "Why, no, the ghost." "Oh, certainly. Gabrielle told me so himself. That's what he knew him by. Gabrielle was in the stage manager's office. Suddenly the door opened, and the Persian entered. You know the Persian." "Oh, yes," answered the little ballet girls in chorus, warding off ill luck by pointing their forefinger and little finger at the absent Persian, while their second and third fingers were bent on the palm and held down by the thumb. "And you know how superstitious Gabrielle is," continued Jeanne. "However, he is always polite. When he meets the Persian, he just puts his hand in his pocket and touches his keys. Well, the moment the Persian entered in the doorway, Gabrielle gave one jump from his chair to the lock of the cupboard, so as to touch iron. In doing so, he tore a whole skirt of his overcoat on a nail. Hurrying to get out of the room, he banged his forehead against a hat peg and gave himself a huge bump. Then, suddenly, stepping back, he skinned his arm on the screen near the piano. He tried to lean on the piano, but the lid fell on his hands and crushed his fingers. He rushed out of the office like a madman, slipped on the staircase, and came down the whole of the first flight on his back. I was just passing with Mother. We picked him up. He was covered with bruises. We were frightened out of our lives, but all at once he began to thank Providence that he had got off so cheaply. Then he told us what had frightened him. He had seen the ghost behind the Persian, the ghost with the death's head, just like Joseph Buquet described. Jeanne had told her story ever so quickly, as though the ghost were at her heels, and was quite out of breath at the finish. A silence followed, while Sorelli polished her nails in great excitement. It was broken by little Géry, who said, Joseph Buquet would do better to hold his tongue. Why should he hold his tongue? Asked somebody. That's Mother's opinion, replied Géry, lowering her voice and looking all about her, as though fearing lest other ears than those present might overhear. And why is it your mother's opinion? Hush, Mother says the ghost doesn't like being talked about. And why does your mother say so? Because nothing. This reticence exasperated the curiosity of the young ladies, who crowded round little Géry, begging her to explain herself. They were there, side by side, leaning forward simultaneously in one movement of entreaty and fear, communicating their terror to one another, taking a keen pleasure in feeling their blood freeze in their veins. I swore not to tell, gasped Géry. But they left her no peace and promised to keep the secret until Géry, burning to say all she knew, began with her eyes fixed on the door. Well, it's because of the private box. What private box? The ghost's box. Has the ghost a box? Oh, do tell us, do tell us. Not so loud, said Géry. It's box 5, you know, the box on the grand tier, next to the stage box on the left. Oh, nonsense. I tell you it is. Mother has charge of it. But you swear you won't say a word? Of course, of course. Well, that's the ghost's box. No one has had it for over a month, except the ghost, and orders have been given at the box office that it must never be sold. And does the ghost really come there? Yes. Then somebody does come? Why, no. The ghost comes, but there is nobody there. The little ballet girls exchanged glances. If the ghost came to the box, he must be seen, because he wore a dress coat and a death's head. This was what they tried to make Chérie understand, but she replied, "That's just it. The ghost is not seen, and he has no dress coat and no head. All that talk about his death's head and his head on fire is nonsense. There's nothing in it. You only hear him when he is in the box. Mother has never seen him, but she has heard him. Mother knows, because she gives him his program." Sorelli interfered. "Chérie, child, you're getting at us." Thereupon little Chérie began to cry. "I ought to have held my tongue if Mother ever came to know. But I was quite right. Joseph Buquet had no business to talk of things that didn't concern him. It will bring him bad luck. Mother was saying so last night." There was a sound of hurried and heavy footsteps in the passage, and a breathless voice cried, "Cécile, Cécile, are you there?" "It's Mother's voice," said Jean. "What's the matter?" She opened the door. A respectable lady, built on the lines of a Pomeranian grenade launcher, burst into the dressing room and dropped groaning into a vacant armchair. Her eyes rolled madly in her brick-dust-colored face. "How awful," she said. "How awful." What? Joseph Buquet." "What about him?" "Joseph Buquet is dead." The room became filled with exclamations, with astonished outcries, with scared requests for explanations. "Yes, he was found hanging in the third-floor cellar." "It's the ghost," little Chérie blurted, as though in spite of herself. But she at once corrected herself, with her hands pressed to her mouth. "Oh, no, I didn't say it. All around her, her panic-stricken companions repeated under their breaths, "Yes, it must be the ghost." Sorelli was very pale. "I shall never be able to recite my speech," she said. Jeanne gave her opinion while she emptied a glass of liqueur that happened to be standing on a table. "The ghost must have something to do with it. The truth is that no one ever knew how Joseph Buquet met his death. In the memoirs from one of the opera house managers, the incident is described as follows. A grievous accident spoiled the little party which Debienne and Poligny gave to celebrate their retirement. I was in the manager's office when the acting manager suddenly came darting in. He seemed half mad and told me that the body of a scene shifter had been found hanging in the third cellar under the stage. I shouted, "Come and cut him down." By the time I had rushed down the staircase and the Jacob's ladder, the man was no longer hanging from his rope. So this is an event which seems natural. A man hangs at the end of a rope. They go to cut him down. The rope has disappeared. There's a very simple explanation. If you listen to the memoir, it was just after the ballet, and leaders and dancing girls lost no time in taking their precautions against the evil eye. There you are. Picture the corps de ballet scuttling down the Jacob's ladder and dividing the rope amongst themselves in less time than it takes to write. When, on the other hand, I think of the exact spot where the body was discovered, the third cellar underneath the stage. Imagine that somebody must have been interested in seeing that the rope disappeared after it had effected its purpose. And time will show if I am wrong. The horrid news soon spread all over the opera, where Joseph Buquet was very popular. The dressing rooms emptied, and the ballet girls, crowding around Sorelli, like timid sheep around their shepherdess, made for the foyer through the ill-lit passages and staircases, trotting as fast as their little pink legs could carry them. Chapter 2. The New Margarita. On the first landing, Sorelli ran against the Comte de Chagny, who was coming upstairs. The Count, who was generally so calm, seemed generally excited. "I was just going to you," he said, taking off his hat. "Oh, Sorelli, what an evening! And Christine Daae, what a triumph!" "Impossible," said Chérie. 6 months ago, she used to sing like a crock. But do let us get by, dear Count," continued the brat, with a saucy curtsy. "We are going to inquire after a poor man who was found hanging in the cellar." Just then, the acting manager came fussing past and stopped when he heard this remark. "What?" he exclaimed roughly. "Have you girls heard already? Well, please forget about it for tonight, and above all, don't let Debienne and Poligny hear. It would upset them too much on their last day." They all went on to the foyer of the ballet, which was already full of people. The Comte de Chagny was right. No performance ever equaled this one. And the great composers of the day had conducted their own works in turn. Christine Daae had revealed her true self on that evening, for the first time, to the astonished and enthusiastic audience. But the real triumph was reserved for when she began to sing a few passages from Romeo and Juliet. It was the first time that the young artist had sang this work, which had not been transferred to the opera. Those who heard her say that her voice in these passages was seraphic. But this was nothing to the superhuman notes that she gave forth in the prison scene. No one has ever heard or seen anything like it. Daae revealed a new margarita that night, a margarita of a splendor, a radiance hitherto unsuspected. The whole house went mad, rising to its feet, shouting, cheering, clapping, while Christine sobbed and fainted in the arms of her fellow singers and had to be carried to her dressing room. A few subscribers, however, protested. Why had so great a treasure been kept from them all that time? Till then, Christine Daae had played a good secondary part to Carlotta's rather too splendidly material Margarita, and it had needed Carlotta's incomprehensible and inexcusable absence from this night for the little Daae, at a moment's warning, to show all that she could do in a part of the program reserved for the Spanish diva. Well, what the subscribers wanted to know was, why had Dabien and Poligny applied to Daae when Carlotta was taken ill? Did they know of her hidden genius? And if they knew of it, why had they kept it hidden? And why had she kept it hidden? Oddly enough, she was not known to have a professor of singing at that moment. She had often said she meant to practice alone for the future. The whole thing was a mystery. The Comte de Charny, standing up in his box, listened to all this frenzy and took part in it by loudly applauding. He was just 41 years of age. He was a great aristocrat and a good-looking man, above middle height and with attractive features, in spite of his hard forehead and his rather cold eyes. He was exquisitely polite to the women and a little haughty to the men, who did not always forgive him for his successes in society. He had an excellent heart and an irreproachable conscience. On the death of the old Count, he became the head of one of the oldest and most distinguished families in France, whose arms dated back to the 14th century. They owned a great deal of property, and when the old Count, who was a widower, died, it was no easy task for Philippe to accept the management of so large an estate. His two sisters and his brother, Raoul, would not hear of a division and waived their claim to their shares, leaving themselves entirely in Philippe's hands, as though the right of primogeniture had never ceased to exist. When the two sisters married, on the same day, they received their portion from their brother, not as a thing rightfully belonging to them, but as a dowry for which they thanked him. Their mother, the Comtesse, had died in giving birth to Raoul, who was born 20 years after his elder brother. At the time of the old Count's death, Raoul was 12 years of age. Philippe busied himself actively with the youngsters' education. He was admirably assisted in this work, first by his sisters, and afterward by an old aunt, the widow of a naval officer, who gave young Raoul a taste for the sea. The lad entered the Borda training ship, finished his course with honors, and quietly made his trip round the world. Then he enjoyed a long furlough, which would not be over for 6 months, and already the dowagers he met were pitying the handsome and apparently delicate stripling for the hard work in store for him. The shyness of the sailor lad, I was almost saying his innocence, was remarkable. He seemed to have just left the women's apron strings. As a matter of fact, petted as he was by his 2 sisters and his old aunt, he had retained from this purely feminine education manners that were almost candid and stamped with a charm that nothing had yet been able to sully. He was a little over 21 years of age and looked 18. He had a small, fair mustache, beautiful blue eyes, and a complexion like a girl's. Philippe spoiled Raoul. To begin with, he was very proud of him and pleased to foresee a glorious career for his junior in the Navy, in which one of their ancestors had held the rank of admiral. He took advantage of the young man's leave of absence to show him Paris, with all its luxurious and artistic delights. The Count considered that, at Raoul's age, it is not good to be too good. Philippe himself had a character that was very well balanced in work and pleasure alike. His demeanor was always faultless, and he was incapable of setting his brother a bad example. He took him with him wherever he went. He even introduced him to the foyer of the ballet. I know that the Count was said to be on terms with Sorelli, but it could hardly be reckoned as a crime for this nobleman, a bachelor, with plenty of leisure, especially since his sisters were settled, to come and spend an hour or 2 after dinner in the company of a dancer who, though not so very, very witty, had the finest eyes that ever were seen. And besides, there are places where a true Parisian, when he has the rank of the Comte de Charny, is bound to show himself. And at that time, the foyer of the ballet at the opera was one of those places. Lastly, Philippe would perhaps not have taken his younger brother behind the scenes of the opera if Raoul had not been the first to ask him, repeatedly renewing his request with a gentle obstinacy which the Count remembered at a later date. On that evening, Philippe, after applauding the Daae, turned to Raoul and saw that he was quite pale. "Don't you see," said Raoul, "that the woman's fainting?" "You look like fainting yourself," said the Count. "What's the matter?" But Raoul had recovered himself and was standing up. "Let's go and see," he said. "She never sang like that before." The Count gave his brother a curious smiling glance and seemed quite pleased. They were soon at the door leading from the house to the stage. Numbers of subscribers were slowly making their way through. Raoul tore his gloves without knowing what he was doing, and Philippe had much too kind a heart to laugh at him for his impatience. But he now understood why Raoul was absent-minded when spoken to, and why he always tried to turn every conversation to the subject of the opera. They reached the stage and pushed through the crowd of gentlemen, scene shifters, supers, and chorus girls, Raoul leading the way, feeling that his heart no longer belonged to him. His face set with passion, while Count Philippe followed him with difficulty and continued to smile.